So hello, thank you everybody for joining us. Welcome to our energy crisis briefing, looking at media narratives around the US-Iran conflict in the energy sector. I'd like to introduce our Chief Insights Officer, Khali Sakkas, who is hosting our webinar this evening, and she'll introduce the other speakers. Thanks, Khali.
Thank you, Paul. Welcome everybody to CARMA's Energy Crisis Briefing. I'm Khali. I'll be your host today. I'll be sharing with you the latest research from the US-Iran conflict, our deep dive into the emerging energy narratives and what that means for PR and comms. I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by some real experts in this field. They're bringing significant experience and expertise to our debate today. First of all, we have Frank Kane, editor, award-winning journalist and editor-at-large at the Arabian Gulf Business Insight, communications consultant to the Saudi Energy Ministry, and somebody who has been really offering insights and reporting on the energy crisis to help us see meaning and and understand it in more depth. A big welcome, Frank.
Thanks, Khali. Pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thank you for joining. Our next panel member is Sean Trainer, CEO and co-founder of Salient. He comes with extensive experience in the UK nuclear industry, where he spent 18 years. He's also spent the last 10 years offering strategic advice to clients throughout the Middle East. A real expert, Sean. You've got some sharp insights on the conflict, some really sharp observations on what's next for energy as well. So welcome and thank you for lending your brain today.
Thank you, Khali.
I'm going to be walking through some of our research. We'll be stopping and pausing at select moments in time to really kick off discussions with our panel to really tease out some of the most important trends that we're witnessing. I'm going to start by looking at the conflict. We'll then move to the energy crisis, OPEC, and key findings. But what we wanted to start to do is set the scene. What are the shifting and emerging narratives around the conflict now? So let's have a look at how it has played out over time. What you can see here is the volume of media coverage, social media and media, over time, and the impact of the conflict on key sectors. And we can see here that on February 28, it obviously emerges as a defense story. And as time goes on, this transitions to a global energy story where the global energy industry is the most impacted. And you can see here this timeline where energy and aviation really become the dominant sectors is when we're in that ceasefire period. So intense global attention to the industry. CARMA has been analysing the conflict and the energy sector in depth from many different angles. One of the ways that we've looked at this is to really break down the coverage into from what lens are we seeing this coverage? Are we seeing it from an environmental lens? Are we seeing it from a political lens? And you can see here the numbers really tell a story that this is a political lens story, but the energy crisis and the economic impact as a result has really come into the forefront of reporting. You can also see that the legal ramifications of military action, the environmental impact, and the individual have really had negligible levels of coverage throughout. We haven't seen that focus on those topics. Our insights team have also looked at the coverage of the conflict through qualitative and quantitative metrics. Here we're tracking 3 leading narratives. We're tracking it in news media and social media. You can see here over time the leading narrative that there was vulnerability and uncertainty within news reports. That leading theme has been on the steady decline since February 28. When we look at social media, it tells a completely different story. You can see here the social media story has wild spikes. It's got sharp peaks. It's also, at this point in time, has higher levels of vulnerability, higher levels of frustration than it did at the start of the conflict. So we see here that audiences, populations are going through some anxiety, obviously, and this has significant implications for communications. When we do some statistical correlations between these narratives as well, we see something really interesting. And I always think this brings up the human element to this data that we've analyzed. When frustration spikes throughout this time period, resilience always follows. So we see this pattern again and again, and it's quite a human response. When something, when we're under attack or there's an unprovoked aggression towards us, we rise from that, claiming that we'll be stronger, that we will get through this, that we are enough. And we've seen plenty of that messaging. It's now quite an established pattern on social media. When we look at the country split, some interesting patterns emerge. And the thing that really jumped out to us as an update from the previous research that we did on the conflict is that now when you look at that proportion of vulnerability and uncertainty amongst countries, there is more vulnerability in Asia than the Gulf states. And that's a real demonstration of the impact of the energy crisis on that narrative. Two other interesting movements here. When we first presented this view a few weeks ago, the United Kingdom and the United States had exactly the same proportion of uncertainty, frustration, and resilience. You can see here that that frustration and vulnerability has actually increased in the UK. Again, an indication that the energy crisis is pinching and there's some negativity in media. We also saw vulnerability increase in Israel as well. They're the leading narratives. They're the things that we're seeing come through. But there's also emerging narratives. There's also things that are under the radar. And one of those things that's starting to circulate, and I'm not sure whether it will gain enormous traction, but we're seeing it that Iran was not the end game for the US. Right? There's a picture emerging that maybe Ukraine was the first move, then Venezuela. The picture then comes into Iran, and potentially this is a move by the US to weaken China. Obviously, in media coverage, there's a lot of commentary saying that this is a win for China, a lot saying that it's not a win for China. But obviously, this is under the surface, rumbling along media, coming mostly from the US at this point. I'll stop there because I know our panelists have got quite strong views on this topic. Frank, I'll start with you. Do you give these theories much credit? Where do you see this? Do you think this is part of a wider chess game?
This idea, I mean, I won't call it conspiracy theory, but it has some of the elements of that. This notion that Trump is playing some incredible game of 8D chess or something, and that the real goal is to strangle China, from its energy supply, its trade routes, etc., etc. This idea has been around for a while. There is a kind of subsidiary theory here, which is that he is also trying to take out his biggest rivals in the hydrocarbon markets, i.e. the producers of the Middle East at the same time. And I can see why it's persuasive, because, all the moves that he's done have certainly had an effect on Chinese energy supply. But I think that gives him, rather too much credit for sophistication. I think that, what we've seen are the unintended consequences of quite a spontaneous and Israeli prompted, if you like, attack on Iran. I don't think he really saw this coming after that. He thought it'd be over in a few days, and in fact, it's lasted much longer. But it's having that effect. And he is currently, as we know, in Beijing talking this through. Has this made his position stronger there or not? I mean, probably not. But sorry, in answer to your question, I think cock up rather than conspiracy.
Sean, I'd love to hear your views. Is this a masterpiece or a masterpiece?
Let me take my tin hat off for a moment. I'm not a
Your conspiracy
theorist.
theories aside, please. Yes.
But I think the proof will be in the pudding. So let's see what this visit to China is all about. I think there'll be some deals struck. So I think the first thing that springs to mind is keep your friends close and your enemies closer, perhaps. But if there is a conspiracy theory, I think it might go wider than just China. I think what I'm seeing is a clear strategy to disrupt, to destroy any committees, groups, collusion between countries. Divide and conquer, I think, is probably the way I'd describe it. So we can see that the president has a disdain for things like NATO, the UN, the EU, and BRICS, I think, is one of those. And when you look at the probably uncoincidental entry of Iran into that BRICS economy, that group, along with the players in the Middle East, if I was in Mr. Trump's shoes, I would be feeling slightly threatened by the existence of the petrodollar, to be honest. So perhaps this is a wider BRIC conspiracy theory rather than just China.
Can I just add something there, Khali, if you don't mind? It's just a neat little aphorism which counts as Sean's. Henry Kissinger once said, I think it was in the context of Vietnam, he said, to be America's enemy can be dangerous, but to be America's friend can be fatal. And there are some people in the Middle East who at the very beginning thought that was certainly the case. Why has he done this? What's he doing? He's wrecking our economy. Anyway, sorry, it's just a little aphorism.
It's a powerful quote. Look, let's watch this space to see whether this really ascends into mainstream media. It's obviously been around for some time, but I think, Sean, to your tin hat analogy, I think it's going to actually merge towards conspiracy theory very, very quickly, and we'll see this narrative shift as time goes on. We're now going to really look at the energy crisis in depth. And this analysis that we're presenting today is based on 60,000 items of media articles and social media globally. So what we're presenting is a global view. We've done quantitative and qualitative analysis using AI to really make sure that we're learning to understand and unpack how this is being reported and what are the implications. The first thing we set out to do is to say, where is this going? What is the forecast? What are the media predictions of the crisis? How long will this last? Is this going to be prolonged? Is it going to be short? So we analyzed wherever we saw a prediction or a forecast or an outlook, we analyzed that and categorized it. The insights that we draw from this is obviously that there's a prevailing forecast that this will be a prolonged tight market in the energy. So of media that had a prediction, 46% really believe that this will be a prolonged crisis. And the evidence that we're seeing today with some major organizations coming out and validating, that some longer timelines here today, I think that this is obviously where most experts, analysts sit. Secondly, though, we're seeing that the prediction that demand destruction is going to play a much more vital role. It's been ever present in media coverage from February 28 till now, but it is on the up and will likely play a huge role. A quarter of our coverage predicted a short crisis, so predicted that this will be over in 1 or 2 days, that we're going to get back to normal. That's looking quite unlikely, but you'll see on the next slide what has triggered that type of prediction. Interestingly too, and this is a theme that runs right through our research, only 2% of analysts or journalists have predicted that this will accelerate that transition to green energy. So some interesting trends coming out in terms of the opportunities and risks for clean energy in general. When we look at at these predictions over time, you can see this really sharp spike in that short shock prediction at the ceasefire. And you can see that those news triggers still trigger a huge reaction by media commentators. But all of those, that hope for the short crisis has been really outweighed by signals for a much more prolonged crisis. So, Frank, I'll stop here because you've written a lot on demand destruction. You've given us some insight into that. I'd love to hear your views on the role that demand destruction has played and will play in the future.
Yeah, sure. I mean, looking at those results, it looks as though the media, for once, got it largely correct. And I guess the people who were predicting a short, sharp shock were, mainly in the sort of Trump camp, weren't they? Because that's what he intended in the first place. But demand destruction, yeah, we are certainly seeing it, and in a big way. The IEA. Their monthly report for May came out today. It was full of very sobering and quite gloomy stuff, I've got to say. World oil demand is going to drop. Oil output from the Middle East has dropped hugely. 14 million barrels a day have been lost. 1 billion in total since February the 28th. And the oil price gyrating between $50 and $125 in that period. All these are the bare bones of demand destruction. Remember that there are two kinds of demand destruction. One is the careful strategy of replacing hydrocarbons with renewables, alternatives, nuclear, etc. That requires decades of investment and planning and strategy. The other is the situation which we have today, where prices are simply too high for people to afford the product. And in any case, the product is not available as it was before. So, certainly demand destruction is happening, and it will get worse. The crunch looms at the end of this month, according to many experts. Prepare for the new era of demand destruction, I think, is the message.
Thank you, Frank. Sean, you've been really thinking about the future scenarios here of the conflict, but also the energy sector. Talk to us about where you see this going. Obviously, I believe that you would obviously see this as a prolonged movement, but talk us about how long that is and what are the levers that might influence the length of the crisis.
I think it's evident this isn't a short spike, but coming back to the hope, hope is not a strategy, right? And when you look at the last 100 years of trying to sort of match the energy trilemma between security, affordability, and sustainability, it's clear to me that security is trumping them all right now. We want our lights to stay on. We want to fire up our AI data centers, and whatever the cost and whatever the environmental consequence, I guess. Now, there comes a point where that has to normalize and stabilize and get the mix right. But I think rather than this just being yet another energy crisis, and I think we've had 7 over the last 50 years or so, I see this more as a sort of a game changer, really. I think this is now making economies really consider the supply chain issues, domicile energy sources. We're talking in the UK about, firing up the oil rigs, bring back the coal mines, really, So I think the focus is on security. As a strong nuclear proponent, thank goodness, although I'm not sure why it took 30 years to get the message across, but it has, and it's landed. So I think what we'll see coming out of this is more long-term integrated policies, perhaps. Saudi lead the way in that for sure, as do the UAE. So I think there's a lot of lessons perhaps for the rest of the world who are more driven by the wind of public opinion to take a far more integrated and long-term approach, to be honest.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that this is new, that this is obviously it's not like previous energy crises you've seen and analyzed. So that's really interesting. A more seismic shift on the structure of the industry. Thank you, Sean. Let's move through now to look at the levers that came through. So what were the things that were determining those outlooks? No surprises here. Obviously, the strait has to open up, that export continuity, the most critical factor in that equation, but followed by policy reactions. So this is policy reactions on energy. Journalists, commentators are really heavily relying on what they're seeing from governments to see where this will go and the impact that will have. So demand destruction, as Frank has said, playing an ascending role here, an incredibly important role in the future outlook. I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about the context and the actual width of the crisis and the global nature of it. So as you can see here, this is a map showing the global severity index, and we can see here that the energy crisis is indeed global. It started off as a local issue and is now completely global, but we're seeing a very uneven impact, different experiences depending on where you live, what parts of the world. So an interesting way to look at it, this equation looks at things like the oil price, oil reserves, food security, and shipping metrics from each country, and really tries to classify that in real time. So a global crisis with local and global impact. One of the stories that caught my eye in the Financial Times was the impact that it has had on rose growers and the tea industry in Kenya. We're seeing this massive financial losses, 4.2 million in March alone. We're seeing that shipping costs are the highest they've been in 10 years. And this has meant that farmers, producers have had to destroy over 130 million rose stems. So the impact on communities, the impact that this is having on every continent really comes to light. Obviously, in Asia, we see a war 1,000 miles away really having a severe impact in some of our markets in APAC. And I think that it's very sobering warnings from the UNDP. They're saying that over 8.8 million may be pushed into poverty because of the fuel crisis within Asia. They're predicting that massive financial losses of up to 299 billion in financial losses from the Asia Pacific market. So a very sobering, a very gloomy outlook for Asia, and they're under acute pressure to try and get out of the pain that they're under. We look now to aviation, right? And this is one of the earliest industries to capture headlines in this crisis. The jet fuel shortage is in crisis mode, and we're seeing over 13,000 flights cut since February 28. We're also seeing the demise of some specific airlines like Spirit Airlines. So the aviation sector in the spotlight, under pressure, and the jet fuel shortage is continually putting this spotlight on the industry. I wanted to turn now to look at how are governments responding to these issues? How are they reacting to give communities relief to the type of acute situations that they're in? When we look at the IEA policy tracker that tracks every policy globally that's been put in place from the energy crisis, I can only categorize it under one term, that most governments are buying time. And that's because they had to act quickly and they didn't know the length of the situation that they were in. But we're seeing broadly policy responses favoring untargeted, fast, low-cost demand reduction. We're seeing things like fuel cuts. We're seeing price caps. We're seeing transport subsidies. We're seeing free transport in many countries. We're also seeing that energy bills are being cushioned to try and take the pain from consumers. Really interesting points about fuel tax cuts. Sean, I know you have very strong views on this. I'll pass to you. What's your assessment of what you've seen in terms of those sort of short, sharp measures that have gained the headlines so far? What's your assessment of what's going on here?
It has to be done, obviously. I think the interesting thing for me is it's really shone a light on who gets the most money out of petrol. So when you look at the oil producers and how much their proportion of the gas bill is, it's a lot less than what the governments are taking in tax and levies. So of course they have to step in and reduce that blow, and they'd be foolish not to. I will come back to a cautionary tale from the 1970s crisis, where the knee-jerk reaction from the UK was to ration fuel at the petrol pumps. The unintended consequence of that was that there was massive queues and everyone was filling up their tank at the between stations, basically, which meant the ullage of the petrol in the UK ended up in everyone's car tanks rather than the fuel tanks. So therefore, petrol consumption went up. And as they looked over to their neighbours in Ireland and thought they were stupid because they had the opposite policy, which was a minimum spend on fuel, guess what? People thought, I'm not going to fill up my car and have the petrol sitting there at great cost. I'll take my bike instead, kind of thing, right? So their fuel consumption went down. So yes, this knee-jerk reaction has to happen, but I hope, I said earlier, hope isn't a strategy, but I do hope we learn from history and don't do these knee-jerks that end up with these unintended consequences.
Look, thank you, Sean. I'll talk you through some of the findings that we've seen, and then I'll pass on to Frank. But we can see Asia obviously acutely impacted, but we can see that of the top 10 countries by the number of measures that they've brought in, Asia's the 9 out of 10 of these, and Sri Lanka leads. So we can see quite a strong response throughout those impacted regions. We can also see the chart on the right here is showing the billions of euros that have gone into targeted versus untargeted measures in Europe. And I think there's beginning to be, or there's continually criticism of that short, sharp blanket response, and that perhaps we should really be focused more about supporting the most vulnerable rather than the easy fix of blanket strategies. Frank, keen to hear your thoughts on this one.
Look, I mean, energy subsidies are a very thorny issue in the Middle East, where they have been used as an instrument of domestic economic policy for many years, and we thought we were slowly, weaning ourselves off them here. Who knows whether this will, bring them back at some stage? But it's also very opposite in terms of what's happening in the US, where we've seen inflation spiking mainly due to an increase in the price of gas at the pump, and now there's much speculation that Trump is about to, cut or eliminate altogether federal gasoline tax as a purely domestic political issue ahead of the midterms. So I would beware governments, playing around with tax and subsidies. Because that's often done for political reasons rather than economic reasons.
Very interesting. Cautionary tales from both of you. I wanted to highlight quickly a standout amongst those global measures coming through. And when you look at Sri Lanka and the number of measures, they are the world leader in the number of measures they have implemented, but it's also the width of their comprehensive list. So the far-reaching ways that they've tried to actually ease this suffering. So obviously closing public offices on Wednesdays, closing schools and universities on Wednesdays, switching off billboard lighting after 9 p.m, introducing a QR code-based fuel rationing system. These are the types of things that really helped them in the initial period of shock. And I think that if you look at the effectiveness of these measures, the jury is still out. Media is reporting a mixed response, a mixed effectiveness. But Sri Lanka really quick to respond and leading in terms of global measures. Let's now talk about how this impacts reputations, how these measures have been communicated. What is the reputational impact, the risks and the opportunities? We're looking more now at a communications lens and who has really worked hard to build and lead through this, and the risks associated with that too. I think in general, what we're seeing is that the leading voices, the leading narratives have all come from these simple statements. Those simple one-liners are still really cutting through. We always talk about keeping it simple, and this is a perfect demonstration of the effectiveness of simplicity. Sometimes with responses, potentially from the EU, that complexity is getting lost by global media reporting. Here you can see one of the four of the leaders that we'd like to highlight who are carving a little bit of the voice for themselves. Obviously, we've got people that should be leading this. Obviously, the IEA has become the primary face, but that one tagline, right? This is the biggest energy security threat in history. That is the most quoted phrase in the energy crisis coverage so far. Shows that ability to be quoted, that short, simple statements are really cutting through. When we look at the European Commission and Accelerate EU, we're seeing a little bit more complexity, but we're also seeing the EU generally being painted as this dependency critic, and obviously big calls that the EU cannot be over dependent on imported energy. Looking further afield to Asia, the new-ish Japanese Prime Minister has really emerged as the good neighbor in media coverage. So she's pledged $10 billion out to help her Asian neighbors, and we see a real increase in regional coordination between Japan, Singapore, Japan, Australia, Australia, Singapore. So very much Asia coming together or trying to really help each other. In the Philippines, we can see some of the most acute pressure, and it was the first country to declare a state of emergency. And this has really been President Marcos Jr. has really carved out a space leading not only the Philippines and advocating for that market, but leading the debate within Asia as well and cutting through to global outlets. Obviously not the only voices we're hearing, but some of the people that are being incredibly prominent and are having success in building their responses and building their reputations at the same time. CARMA analyzed the macro ways that regions are being framed in the energy crisis because we wanted to see the patterns. We wanted to see, first of all, the patterns, but is there a shift in the way that markets are being positioned? On this slide, you can see the results of our analysis, and you can see that some framing patterns represent risk for some markets and for some leaders. If you look at Asia on the left, most commonly, Asia is painted as the exposed importer. We see coverage painting it as vulnerable, exposed, and really in need of incredible support. We see the Middle East painted as the epicenter, where everything is happening, where it's the ripple effect across the world. Europe very much being painted as a sleepwalker, walking into a crisis because of its dependency on imported energy. We see the UK being painted with that sleepwalker tag as well quite frequently, but more commonly, it's got this awkward positioning as being stuck in the middle here. It's stuck between net zero. It's stuck between pricing and cost of fuel, and it all hasn't really delivered a clear, coherent path to get itself out of that muddle. So very interesting ways that these markets are being and countries are being portrayed. We also see that the US is most commonly painted as the player that is weaponizing energy, that is really that chaos agent within the crisis. I wanted to point our audience today to the purple, because the purple in this chart is what I see, and potentially too optimistic of me, but I think there's a way for Asia, Europe, and UK to actually recast themselves in this crisis. I think there's room, I think there's time to actually reposition themselves to a more positive light, especially Asia and potentially Europe. Sean, am I being too optimistic? Is there time? Is there the capacity for Asia to turn this around and be perceived more as the agile fixer than the victim here? Can Europe and the UK turn it around so that we see them more as those calm crisis managers rather than sleepwalkers? I'd love your view on whether my optimism is misplaced.
I mean, we come to reputation, and the old saying is you can't sort of talk yourself out of a situation you've walked yourself into, and I guess in this case, sleepwalked yourself into. So it's actions before words, I believe. I hate to look at these. I mean, it's a great way to characterize these regions, but I suspect if you dive deeper into Asia, there's a big difference between India and China, for example, right? So I think you'd see a lot of different granular sort of messages coming from different places. But my temptation is more to look at it holistically, because I think what we've seen here is that the energy system is a massive global system, right? There's a supply chain, there's a whole lot of dependencies on infrastructure. Every economy is unique and different for sure. But there's a sort of big picture here, which I hope comes to light. And I guess going back 100 years to the formation of what was the World Power Congress then, there was a view that actually nations need to get together and really work this stuff out because it's so important. And here we are 100 years later, and it's almost all got divided up and in some cases left to the market to decide. And governments have sort of taken a back seat and said, okay, the market will decide. Well, I think we're seeing the consequence of that, to be honest.
That's interesting. Frank, do you think that there's, that obviously that governments are doing a lot, they're being incredibly active. Do you think that the likes of Europe and UK can reposition themselves to really make sure that they can remove the shackles of that sleepwalker image?
I would be pessimistic that can happen. Actually, we see Ursula coming out there with a very strong, determined stance against imported energy. But of course, Europe has been dependent on imported energy, for decades. Russian energy, followed by Qatari energy, and now by US energy. Importing huge volumes of US LNG. So the actions don't match the rhetoric, in my opinion. The UK, it seems to flip-flop between wanting to pump more oil in the North Sea and just stop oil altogether. And really, it's a very small player in the global energy market these days. Yeah, I mean, Asia, of course, is huge, and in many ways, Asia has lots of cards. It's being affected in different ways according to different regions. South Asia, in particular, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, have all been, very severely hit. I'm reminded of the story of the huge ceramics industry in Gujarat, which had to close down recently because it couldn't get enough petroleum gas, LPG rather than LNG, in, and it had to close the whole shop down with 400,000 job losses. 400,000. But Pakistan and Bangladesh have been severely impacted. I have friends in Pakistan who have stopped driving, who have stopped eating out because it's simply too expensive. I mean, China is a different case. We can talk about China, maybe later, because that certainly has cards that other countries don't.
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you. Look, it's a watch this space. I think we'll see whether the pessimism or optimism wins the day as we continue to analyze. We talked a little bit about fragmentation before, and this is where we wanted to have a look at the announcement that was a shock to most, that the UAE was going to exit OPEC and OPEC plus. So let's have a look at how that went in global media. This is showing you the volume of coverage that this announcement attained. We can see this huge spike in coverage. And I think this is a case in timing, but it's also a case of the fact that the world's media were already looking towards the UAE. We were already had a heightened anxiety, a heightened awareness of the impact for all other regions. So timing played a huge part in this. You can see on the right the countries that reported this more frequently than any other: the US, India, and the UAE, and Egypt. But this was a big global news story. When we analyzed the coverage, we saw something that we questioned. It was debated internally a lot at CARMA whether we could believe it. We went back and checked it 100 times. But when we looked at articles that either offered a criticism or an endorsement, we saw that there was widespread support, significant support in online media for UAE's decision. 75% versus 25%. Now, the obvious question you then jump to is, what does this mean for OPEC? So we went and analyzed that. So the exit was widely endorsed for UAE, but it was a negative. It did serve as a red flag for OPEC, especially in the West, especially obviously outside of the region. Those that expressed a view were positive or negative reaction, 91% negative towards OPEC, OPEC plus, and obviously strong support for UAE. When we look at the types of messaging and themes that came through, UAE's messaging really came through strongly. So we saw this emphasis on strategic autonomy, flexibility over quotas. We saw these cracks starting to emerge in terms of OPEC fragmentation. 5% of coverage talked about this being the beginning of the end for OPEC. So something that I think largely went UAE's way here, probably too early to tell given the lack of responses from other major players. You're both sitting in this region. You're both experts in this field. I'd love to hear your views in terms of how you thought the announcement went and what's next for OPEC. Frank, maybe we start with you.
Sure. Those numbers really are interesting and quite surprising, but I think they reflect several factors, really. I mean, one is the deep unpopularity of OPEC and OPEC plus in the West, in Europe, and in North America. You know, we all remember, you know, the evil oil sheikhs from the 70s and, you know, earlier. It is a very unpopular organization in the US in particular. It's a cartel, it's a price fixer, etc., etc. So it had a bad press to begin with. Secondly, the UAE came up with a pretty convincing rationale, and they used some pretty persuasive people to get that across. Yusuf Al-Otaiba, the UAE ambassador to Washington, wrote a very well-argued piece in the Financial Times just last week, pointing to the fact that the UAE was aiming to be a post-oil economy. Only 25% of its income comes from oil now, and that the strictures and structures of OPEC plus were no longer appropriate for it. And you know, it has invested billions and billions into capacity, and it was silly to invest all this and not be able to increase capacity as it saw fit in its national interest. And these were all very valid points made by Mr. Al-Otaiba. I mean, I would add a couple of other points there that didn't really get quite so well elaborated. One is the rather tense relationship between Saudi Arabia and the UAE. That must have been a factor in their decision to move. And secondly, the kind of corrosive effect that Russia has in most international forums. I think the UAE felt a bit miffed, really, and rather resentful of increased Russian influence within OPEC plus.
Yeah, it certainly seems that way. Sean, your views and interest, I'm keen to hear what you think here, because you've spoken about sort of the future scenarios of fragmentation, of this idea of the dialogue turning into the monologue, deterioration in terms of that cooperation and cooperative spirit. Where do you see this playing out? What's the next step here for OPEC or the UAE?
Well, I mean, I think the first thing is, another win for America, right? Fragmentation. Let's split up all the clubs, especially those that threaten our economy. But of course, it was a great move for the UAE to release those shackles. I cannot help but use the parallels with the UK leaving Brexit, Europe through Brexit. You could look at OPEC and the EU as both failed projects, and very good reasons for member parties to part ways. I guess the only difference is they had a referendum in the UK, which obviously led to a whole lot of mixed messages, and didn't really talk about the truth of the economic rationale for leaving the EU. But when you think of that parallel, the reason I throw that in there is that there was a lot of speculation that the UK leaving the EU would be the end of the EU. Well, we've not seen that yet. I don't think we will see that. And similarly with OPEC Plus, I don't see this as the demise. It may reconstitute, reform in some ways, but let's not forget, whatever you think of OPEC or whatever you think of the EU, they were both projects that were created and formed for a good reason, right? And I think as a result, they will continue. In what shape or form? Again, it's another one of those time will tell scenarios, I think.
Yeah, watch this space. And obviously,
I'd like to take issue with you there, Sean, on just one point. I don't see OPEC as a failed organization in the same way that you say the EU is a failed organization. It certainly has since COVID, in particular, where which was another dramatic crisis that the energy industry faced. It has slowly, surely, and carefully rebalanced supply and demand in global oil markets. And got stability in pricing too. So I don't think it failed. I think it had internal issues, especially with Russian involvement, but that's a separate matter. Sorry, I just want to make that point.
We're agreeing. Yeah. I don't think the EU was a failed project or was OPEC. I'm saying perceived as, right? So the sentiment seen against OPEC is similar to
perception is everything, of course. Perception is everything. Yeah,
but they both serve good purposes. And to your point, that economic stabilizer is the reason it exists, and that's the reason why it should continue.
Exactly. Thank you.
So we're well agreeing, I think, Frank.
I think we're violently agreeing with each other. I think we've reached that point. Yes, we're aligned.
It's no good when you agree. You've got to fall out sometime. Anyway, go on.
All right. Well, maybe we can have a fight in the key takeaways for communicators. Let's see how we go here. Obviously, when we do this type of research, it's always important to reflect, to see what we can learn. Some data sets offer glimmers of narratives that will help inform planning and strategy. And here we certainly got some clear takeaways, not just for the energy sector. I think these are for all clients, organizations, and brands having to communicate and navigate through this landscape. It's a significant challenge. So we're going to, just before we move to questions, I'm going to walk through the 6 key takeaways that we believe are important for PR and comms. Obviously, number 1, I highlighted at the start of today's session, these high levels of vulnerability and uncertainty. We see this especially amongst audiences on social media, and we see that as a distinct challenge for proactive campaigns and building communities on social media at this time. Empathy and a renewed focus on individual impact will probably land well and might be required. So you've seen here that individual lens from the conflict, but also the energy crisis, has mostly been lost in media coverage. Secondly, impact is acute and uneven. Ensure that your global announcements are passing those all-important local context tests. And this means that coordination between global HQ, regional offices, and local offices needs to strengthen and be tighter than ever. And why that's important is because message consistency is absolutely fundamental. It's fundamental for building trust and for making sure that you've got those messages working well throughout those layers. There are people going through very different experiences globally. And when you're doing a global campaign, we see a lot of CARMA's clients do this, offer a masterclass in how to coordinate these campaigns. Right now, it's an incredibly tricky time. Number 3, earnings announcements have become a well-oiled machine for PR and comms. We see really what good looks like in terms of major announcements for quarterly earnings and full-year reporting. In this period, though, you're going to quite likely have a larger audience and more scrutiny than ever before. The winners, and there are clear winners, will need to navigate the potential backlash. The losers will also have a difficult time presenting a believable outlook for survival beyond here. So really a difficult time for both of those camps. It's really a matter of precise level planning, keeping it short, keeping things concise, making sure those earnings announcements results land well or as well as possible. We believe that the opportunities do exist for proactive media coverage within this, but we do advocate to proceed with caution. And the next 3 are really about whether to play in this space, whether to become proactive or really to hold back. When people are communicating, we're seeing that discipline and delivery focus is absolutely pivotal. Trust is built on saying, walking the walk, talking the talk, that action and words needs to be connected. So brands and organizations that focus on the discipline, focus on execution, will be well placed throughout in this climate. The 5th one, and we'll talk about this, I'd love to hear the views of our panel members, that there's strength in silence. Quite often we work with PR and communications and marketing teams that are go, go, go. It's all about proactive. It's all about making a statement. It's all about being in the media. And at this time, I think it's an unusual thing for me to call for, but given the high level of sensitivity, the high level of anxiety and frustration, we're seeing some of the biggest brands in the world hold back for good reason. And that's because the risk of a disconnect with your audiences, the risk of a backlash is quite heightened. Proactive media is still working really, really well for some, and we've got some really good, we've seen some really good case studies, but we're really advocating to proceed with caution. The last one about energy transition opportunities and risks. Obviously, we can see here that there's a visibility issue with renewables and this move, this idea that this will accelerate the energy transition has failed to cut through in any major way globally. So when there is an opportunity here, but communication on renewable options needs to be much, much louder to actually be significant, but it also crucially needs to address 2 things. It needs to address security and supply issues. They need to be addressed within that messaging in order to even influence the current narrative. So there's some takeaways. I think I will call on you, Sean, because I know that you've kept a watch on the brands and the companies that are still being quite active in this market. Are there any case studies, any brands that you've seen who are doing it really well at this point?
Well, I'll be slightly controversial. Everything you said here makes perfect sense. But I'll say nothing new, right? So we always have to be consistent. We always have to have discipline, etc., etc. I would almost argue that this is now the time for being a bit more creative, actually. So it's okay to have wonky comms, right? It doesn't have to be all that planned and disciplined, because I think with that often comes the missed opportunity, because we're so focused on our spreadsheets and our Gantt charts that we're not actually looking, outside, if you will. So a really good example, very small, but a really good example of being creative is Careem, the local Middle East equivalent of Uber. Clearly, there's less tourism in the UAE, etc. So they've had to make some layoffs. And when you look at this sort of storytelling, it's a bit like the drama triangle between the villain, the victim, and the hero, right? So it's dead easy in a situation like this where the big company can be seen as the villain because they're having to pay off the staff. They could also be seen as the victim because it's outside our control. But they did a bit of a hero campaign by saying, look, we've got some really good guys and girls that we're going to have to get rid of, right? For the reasons beyond our control. So for goodness sake, anyone that's got any sense and are looking for some key talent, here they are, right? So they almost done a recruitment campaign for their own staff, which I think was a really nice move, both in terms of showing that empathy that you were talking about, but also it kind of says, look at us, we're a great brand and we've got great people, and if we could hold on to them, we would. But my goodness, it's a missed opportunity if you're looking for this talent. So it was a bit of a brand building exercise, if you will. So small, but brilliant. I think a really good example of being creative and sort of just, working in the moment, really.
Yeah, that's brilliant. It's a really strong example. It shows that creativity, that it just seems to well-crafted messaging. Frank, I'd love your views. Obviously, we've offered a lot of outlooks here in terms of takeaways. What do you think what's your view on the best smart move for PR and comms during this time?
Right. Well, look, I love your idea of strengthening silence, because I think it perfectly fits the mood of the time. There is such a huge element of uncertainty, the big one being when the Strait of Hormuz will open. And on that date, everything else can be judged and gauged. But in the region where I live, in the Middle East, it looks as though we're heading towards, whenever the strait opens, it looks as though the second and third quarters are going to be pretty flat. The third quarter often is anyway, we know that. So I think corporates and governments that are resisting the temptation, to shout from the rooftops because they don't know, and because they are planning for a big recovery statement in the autumn, I think that's extremely sensible. And they are doing the right thing. If you don't know, don't say, don't give people the impression you do know, and maybe be held to hostage by later events. That's one point. The energy transition point. I think this is a real dilemma for the energy transitionists and for the environmentalists, because this shows, in my view, how dependent the world is on hydrocarbons.
Yes.
And some on the extreme wings of this lobby, they shout, "Just stop oil." Well, now we've seen what happens when you just stop just 20% of oil. This brings huge problems. So they have to rethink, that approach, I think, and maybe this crisis will be a learning curve for them too.
Yeah,
I would hope so.
And just 20% for just 2 months. Imagine.
Yeah.
Well, exactly,
precisely.
Sean. Exactly,
Look
Sean.
at the chaos. I mean, imagine if you really just stop oil.
Good luck with that, as they say.
I'm going to stop monopolizing our chats and throw it to Paul, because I'm sure there are people on the call that have questions for us. In the time that we have left, we may go over time, but I think it's important that if people want to ask a question, that we will hear them out and have a chat about that. Paul, what has come through the chat?
Yep, got a few questions. Thanks, Khali. The first one, with the US-Iran conflict putting energy security and affordability back at the center of media coverage, how is this affecting the way governments, investors, and businesses talk about net zero?
Yeah, I'll take this, because I really think this is something that we will see net zero fade over time, and I think that the answer here is to track it from over the last 2 years, Paul. And I really, for the person that asked that question, I would like to do that to see, as a phrase, has that declined over time? I think it has. It didn't come up at all in the research that we've done and presented today. So it's become green energy. There's other phrases, but I think it's gone out of currency. But I would love to track that over time and really back that up with data for anybody that asked that question. We might follow up with you after the call. Sean, Frank,
Khali, that was, we've seen that sort of decline before the war. If you follow if you follow the COPs recently, you'll know this, Frank, but that great expression about energy addition, not energy transition.
Precisely.
Because the demand, or whatever the demand destruction is, there's one thing for sure: the demand is going up and up and up. And I think there was a prediction, 25% of or whatever the capacity hasn't even been invented yet in terms of the technologies we need. So when it comes to investments, I think what we're seeing here and what's highlighting is what's been decades of underinvestment in all sectors in energy, whether it's nuclear, oil, or renewables, really. So I don't see much. Well, it's highlighting what's already there. I think I don't think we're seeing a radical difference to how we approach this. I think it's just accelerating things, to be honest, in terms of people's thinking.
Yeah, I would go along with that, but probably with the proviso that the world, including the hydrocarbon producing world, is now convinced of the science behind climate change and global warming. And despite all this, there has been no real move apart from by Donald Trump's United States, to leave the Paris Agreement, to change the net zero goals. Some of the wilder things of ESG have been dropped, and that's a good thing. But if this, gets the environmentalists, the energy transitionists, learning something from the hydrocarbon producers about their more inclusive way of getting towards net zero, then that's a valuable lesson.
I think, I'll just add one more point as well. This whole global south, global north thing. I mean, Africa, come back to me on net zero once I've actually got some power to power my home. But we're now seeing this global east and global west dynamic, right? So now these other vulnerable markets and nations are going to come to the fore. So the debate's only going to increase, right? There's going to be, despite best interest of Mr. Trump to kill dialogue, I have a hope that actually this will do nothing but raise more discourse and get these topics discussed more freely. And let's see what happens this year in Riyadh with the World Petroleum Congress and the World Energy Congress next year, because I think those two forums for dialogue and debate should be really interesting, especially where they're being hosted.
Yeah, just throw in one other concept here, if I can. I was in Houston, Texas, at the CERAWeek event in March, where all the talk was of the hemispheric divide. It's no longer global north versus south. It's now west under US control and energy dominance versus the east, who are seen as dependent consumers, victims. The Middle East, of course, that comes smack bang in the middle of all that. But that's the other concept going around now, hemispheric divide.
One more question. As a result of the conflicts with Europe and Asia facing renewed concerns over energy security, grid constraints and rising power costs, is the AI data center boom become a catalyst for energy investment or a new pressure point that could deepen the energy crisis?
Well, Elon Musk's got the answer, isn't he? Just to send all your data centers into space and put some solar panels on them, and then you're good then, and you're not dependent on any territory. Now, clearly, the UAE and the Saudi have made a big play for cheap energy, renewable energies as the power source. So build your AI data centers here. But what we're witnessing is a massive, increase in AI data center build in the US, coincident with the energy dominance thing, which is interesting, I think. And maybe there's a little bit of a hesitancy in building data centers in a politically vulnerable area with the likelihood of destruction. So 100%, AI is going to sort of accelerate quite a lot of the thinking in this one. And may I just add, the sector we don't talk about is construction. So the construction of these data centers and the concrete, etc. That massive energy consumer. So it's not just the operation; it's actually the build of these things.
Yeah, I'd just like to point out that we haven't seen any decline of appetite in the Middle East for investment in data centers, especially in the US. They're still fully behind that. The piece in the FT from Yusuf Al-Otaiba that I quoted earlier, he reinforced the UAE's commitment there to $1.4 trillion worth of investment in the US, a hell of a lot of that in AI and data centers. So it hasn't put people off yet. That's the answer.
From a media point of view, we obviously work with a lot of clients that are actively talking about AI, and we're seeing enormous success with any story about AI or AI technology. It's incredible the impact that AI stories have, and that how there is so much appetite for talking about technology right now. So everybody's quite hungry for that. I think to the point about when does the environmental concerns kick in, I think it is going to become a double-edged sword in the next few months. But as we can see, AI stories landing well, doing really, really well in any market that you can think of. So it's still a very positive story and hasn't had that backlash or that negative shadow that you would sometimes expect.
And one last one, which is actually, conscious of time, quite a nice one to finish on, is, what are your predictions for what comes next? And as comms professionals, comms leaders in the energy space, what should we be thinking about?
What comes next? Well, as I think I've said a couple of times, that all depends on when the Strait opens. And then you can look forward to some kind of recovery strategy, which can take weeks, but probably more like months, and probably into 27. I mean, NASA said just recently he didn't expect normality until 27. As regards the comm strategy that should accompany that, it has to be, once again, to stress resilience. Which has been the buzzword here ever since the first week of the war. The 3 R's I've heard it described as: resilience, recovery, and reinvention. There is an idea that some of the economic models here have to be looked at again in view of the way that they've shown vulnerability in the course of this crisis. So resilience, recovery, reinvention, that's what they're thinking.
Nice. Well, I think for me, up until now, and probably in 2 weeks, it's always been perceived perhaps by the majority as a regional war, right? But we've seen the media coverage in terms of why this has become a global issue. But I don't think it's bit yet. I think in the next couple of weeks, we'll start to see a lot more vulnerability on social media as the people start to feel the pain in their pockets. And that's when the political discourse starts to get interesting, because now you're taken that thing that's over there has now come back to your domestic agenda. Midterm elections, the politics will start to see some of the backlash when this truly bites the global economy. And I think there's a lot of people understand that at the moment are feeling that, but it's not really universally got to the pockets of the consumers and the citizens yet. But I suspect in 2 weeks' time we'll see a big increase there. So I think what that will do, hopefully what that will do, is it will force the leaders and the politicians to get their act together, really. And again, my hope and desire is that we go back to that thinking of 100 years ago, where the world economies need to get together and work out this world problem, rather than it just being left to the markets or being left to the local economies to decide.
Thank you very much. Conscious of time and we've run over. Thank you very much indeed, Khali. Thank you, Sean, and thanks everybody who joined us and for who has lasted the duration is still with us. Stay tuned. We've got a whole series of webinars, some war related, some energy sector related, and some generic industry specific topics, but lots more coming in the near future. So thank you very much, everybody. Goodbye.